Joshua Leisk, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Really good to be here.
Coming from down under. What time is it in Sydney?
It's 8 in the morning. It's actually quite pleasant here today.
So pretty late for you. You get up at 5.
Oh, yeah, it never stops. Yeah.
Well, based on your BornFree.Life protocol, I mean, how many hours have you put into this now? Days,
We're well,
years?
well over 20,000 hours.
Yeah. So obviously Joshua is the creator, founder of the BornFree.Life protocol. I think you reached out to me a couple years ago. At the time, it was pretty impressive, but fast forward to today, it's really a thing of beauty, man. Congrats. So the disease model, and
Mhm.
this is really focusing on chronic fatigue syndrome. As you mentioned, it's an all-encompassing model for
Yeah,
mitochondria
really
dysfunction.
covered. It's essentially everything that's downstream of mitochondrial dysfunction. But that's complex because mitochondrial dysfunction can mean a number of different things. And essentially, what the model is a universal or unifying model, which then explains how there is a core dysfunction. And then, depending on a number of different variables, you get different presentation, different features, different disease states, but ultimately a common cascade that sits underneath it all. And there's quite an interesting amount of data that we can use to show that this is happening in readily available tests. So it's the model itself is built on data. It was formed out of lots and lots and lots of data collection over a number of years, and ultimately a lot of literature review. So it's not coming from anywhere that's woo. It's all very much evidence based. And we're now at a practical point where we can use quite a range of different tests. So, like Mosaic and other organic acids tests, the Therium Aristotle Plus, and of course the OligoScan and other mineral and metal tests that actually visualize all of these dysfunctional pathways.
Maybe I'll let you share your screen so you could kind of just give us like a little quick tour of this. I really love this summary that you provide. It really paints the story of why are we having so many issues? Where do people fall and all these different events that can happen along the journey of life? How about you share your screen and just give us like a little tour of this?
Sure. The website itself is not small. If you try to print it, it's well over about 270 pages. So there's a lot of content. A lot of it relates to the protocol and various different aspects. It's more or less, as it's framed up here, systems biology protocol library. So there's all these different topics, and you can drill down into large amounts of detail. And there's tables of, all sorts of different peer-reviewed literature or the compilation of. So in the disease model page, which is where we are here, there is a description, and that starts off at pre-birth, talks about what can be happening with the gestation period and what might actually end up affecting the development of the child. And then progression into essentially neurodivergence and potentially ME/CFS, long COVID, fibromyalgia, post-vaccine syndrome, everything else. So it talks about how during inflammatory states, the minerals and the metals get moved around between different compartments, and then depending on the state of the metabolism, some of those metals might end up deposited in the brain, the liver, the kidneys, the spleen, and that can lead to mitochondrial dysfunction because a number of the toxic metals end up inhibiting the glutathione metabolism and the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway, NADP redox, various things, and it creates very predictable outcomes. So um, that state becomes a progressive spiral, and this goes into quite some details about the transporters and NAD and NADP redoxes and various different things, but that gets quite complicated. The diagrams, some of them, like this one, a bit of a subway map, and it'll go into all these different pathways you can explore, or you can click and zoom in, explore like the mitochondrial metabolism. You can look at the neurotransmitters. You can look at glycolysis and branched chain amino acids and fatty acid oxidation, transport, all the related things. That's a bit complex. A lot of people are probably not going to need to go into that. However, if you have good data, all of these, or the main diagrams, you can also view in the metabolic pathway tool. So this is the same diagrams with a heat style overlay. So we can take the oligoscan and the either like the oat or therium Aristotle or whichever, and we can look at each of these different metabolites and cofactors and things as a live view. So it's a If we look at something that's red, it's very high. If we look at something that's blue, it's very low, green in the middle, and then ultimately everything in between.
Yeah.
So if we're looking for a pathway dysfunction, we can see bottlenecks, we can see constraints, we can see the what, and we can see the why. So ultimately, we can see, for example, if we've got problems with something building up or something that's stagnating somewhere, then you can often see, okay, well, if I've got certain cofactors that are low, that's going to be affecting the conversion from one thing to another thing.
Yeah.
And then you can start to look at causality, and then you can start to see cascades and things. And because this is, quite complex, there are also other diagrams which then allow you to look at specific well, I suppose blocks of different parts of the metabolism. So we
Yeah.
might look at, for example, the mitochondrial metabolism in reference to NAD and NADP. We might look at, how the NAD redox is affected by, say, oxidative stress, how the oxidative stress is actually managed normally by the glutathione metabolism, how that affects things like the glycogen synthesis, NAD synthesis, and various other things, cell danger response, and then ultimately how this relates back to
The
the
metals.
constraints that are created by the metals
Yeah.
or the mineral deficiencies or the various other things which are going to impact all of these different pieces of the metabolism. So we can actually see causality. We can see where there is pathway dysregulation. We can see why there is pathway dysregulation.
So
And then,
if I'm looking at this, like I'm looking really at, I mean, I'm looking at everything, but I'm looking at the reds as kind of like the flags.
yeah, well, the reds are very high, but even like yellows and oranges are an indication that there's something that's out.
Got it.
So, for example, we can see like elevated glycerol here. We can see functionally in the diagrams describing it as, hey, when you've got problems with NAD redox and we end up with NADH, elevation, some of that can get compensated in different ways. Different reactions are going to compensate. And so, if we see that this thing is high here, for example, it infers that the NADH is actually high and it's overflowing to some of these other enzymes
Got
to
it.
pick up the slack. And then, that same sort of thing. We can see other things, other like alarm bells, if you like. So these can become really useful clinician tools when you're looking at patient data. If you're trying to just see what's going on, is go, well, what's going on with blah blah blah, or what's happening with this pathway, what's happening, and why. Then you can see that very clearly, just as colors. And then, there are different diagrams that you can use as clinician dashboard type diagrams. So like this one, this is kind of a nice block diagram that sort of centers around mitochondrial dysfunction and then gives you different blocks. So you can say, okay, well, where's the signal? If I've got things that are red, I've obviously got a problem. If I've got things that are dark blue, I've obviously got a problem. And then,
Right.
various different things in the middle. So the amount of signal that we can see when we're looking at the glutathione metabolism, we can see, yeah, we've got problems with metals. We can see, the effect, how that plays out for fault sensing and things like that, prolyl hydroxylase inhibition, and then what that means as far as hyperoxaluria, renal wastage of electrolytes and zinc and things like that. And then ultimately, logically, how that plays out in different ways as far as symptom presentation or
Yeah.
viral chronic reactivation and things like that, or the hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome metabolism and thoracic outlet syndrome, chronic cranial instability, and things like that. So different diagrams basically can be helpful clinician tools, but ultimately allow you to understand the mechanisms, like why would the silica be low?
Right.
Why are these metals elevated? Why is glycine low? Things like that.
Yeah.
And then of course you can drill down on it.
Wow.
So yeah, it's quite powerful. The tools accept a number of different data sources. So
Mhm.
we can have, for example, we can use, I'll just change to a different diagram. Sorry, it's a different page.
You
So we
good?
can we can use a number of different metabolite data sources. So there's a range of different OAT, so organic acid tests,
Yeah.
and the current king of the crop is the Therium Aristotle Plus with 296 metabolites, and it even shows NAD and NADH, NADP, NADPH, ATP, a number of other things. So we can actually get to see a lot of the coenzyme and cofactors, things that are really important that previously we'd have to infer. We now have
Yeah.
direct measures for, which is incredible. Um, so it is very useful. It's very powerful. So we actually get to establish causality when we're looking at the metabolic dysregulation. Whereas earlier versions, earlier generations of organic acid testing only gave very limited signal. So very what I would call a low resolution overview of the metabolic pathways. So now we get that high detail.
Wow. It's
Mm.
incredible. It I don't think anybody's done this before.
No, this is definitely a first.
Yeah, it's really, really impressive. Why don't you show us your illegal scan interpretation tool?
Yeah, yeah, I can do that. The OligoScan interpretation tool actually comes through to this pathway overlay tool as well. But there's actually two useful OligoScan tools on there. One is we've got the Find a Practitioner tool, which
Right.
is useful if we're trying to find people. And then we had the PDF processor tool. So this actually takes outputs from the OligoScan and also SOCheck. And what it does is it applies an algorithmic correction, a reinterpretation to create something that you can read at face value. Now, what I found in my research for over a number of years, what I was doing was actually comparing the OligoScan data with white blood cell data for minerals and metals. And I noticed that there was a pattern. The things that we'd been seeing that, if you're reading the OligoScan practitioner's handbook, I think the things like the elevation of zinc had been noted, and it was basically suggested there was like a copper blockade or something else, but
Yeah.
essentially seeing the zinc building up in the tissue. I think that interpretation might not have been wholly accurate, but what
Yeah.
I'd seen was is that that same elevation of the zinc, I was seeing the same thing happening with quite a range of the other minerals. Hadn't seen it on the metals, hadn't seen it with anything with the vitamins. It was literally just the minerals that this applied to. And the pattern was time and time again, when we saw things that were elevated in the oligoscan above a certain threshold, it was actually coming up as low in the white blood cells.
Hmm.
So I think algorithmically, I suspect, and you would know better, I suspect what happened was that the training data that was used to create the algorithm may have included red blood cells. And red blood cells have slightly different metabolism to, say, white blood cells, in that they can act as a bit of a sponge in an inflammatory state. So when certain cytokines are elevated and transporters are being shut down, and then the serum levels, the contents can be quite different, the red blood cells can pick up and carry a lot of these minerals during that burst of activity or that serum flux increase. So it's possible that what the training data actually included was an inflammatory state where the red blood cells had high levels at the same time as, say, the liver or the brain or other functional cells with mitochondria were actually lacking.
Right.
So I think that's basically the flip. But what I saw in all of that data was essentially we were able to kind of see where that kind of there is a point where something that's actually elevated in the oligoscan, and it seems to be roughly somewhere between 11 and 14% on
Uh-huh.
the elevation. Somewhere around about where on the reports, it's where the normal plus line is. It's
Right.
just around there. It flips.
Right.
So if what I've seen is if we saw somebody, for example, where we had snapshots of oligoscan over a few months and weeks, and so quite granular data, and we'd be watching something getting lower and lower and lower because they weren't supplementing that particular mineral, and then it would get so low, and then suddenly it would flip and end up high. And then we'd start supplementing, with that particular mineral, and it'd go from high, flip to low again, and then come up again towards the center. So, having seen that happen quite a number of times, I was quite comfortable that what we were seeing there was an algorithmic error, and not a,
Yeah.
not a something that's actually some sort of constraint and storage in skin and other possible ways to explain it. So I
Right.
think it's just basically the algorithm. Other things that I saw, I couldn't correlate the calcium data to anything. I couldn't correlate the iron data to anything. And so ultimately, I think I'm not quite sure, how that works, but I've removed those two markers because I can't correlate them to anything that's useful. So
Yep.
the way that I look at that is I think it's just challenging to use skin as a data source for that, because ultimately I think like 75% of the iron is circulating and
Right.
roughly 91% of the calcium's in the skeletal tissue. I
Right.
just don't know that we can use skin as a valid source for it. So I've just basically removed that from the output. So
It could be using other metals and or minerals as in somehow calculating those levels.
yeah, well, that's exactly. I mean, you can use proxies. I mean,
Yeah.
manganese, for example, is a reasonable proxy for what's happening with the iron, but it also kind of depends on, as if has the person had like an IV iron infusion, like how the supplement, things like that. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit challenging to basically infer that. So I prefer to use, strangely enough, blood data to have a look at iron, and calcium's a struggle, but white blood cells seem to be a good data source for looking at that when needed. And you can also use things like parathyroid hormone and a few other things to try and get a feel for it. But the key thing to understand, and I mean, I'll be preaching to the choir, everyone that's used OligoScan is using it for a good reason. The serum levels of minerals don't really help. It's like trying to understand what's going on, how much water's in a bath by by the water that's in the pipes. It just
Right.
logically doesn't make sense when you've got like transporters and a logical
Right.
gate in the way. And the serum levels of the electrolytes, I mean, by the time you start seeing the dysregulation or the low levels or whatever in the serum, because they're tightly regulated, that person probably should be in the ER already.
Right.
So yeah, it can be quite misleading. You can see elevations, for example, of magnesium in serum at the same time as things are low actually inside the cells. So it's looking at the same problem from two different, two opposite sides of a doorway.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's important to understand that.
And
Um,
I mean, like, the majority of the lead is going to be in the bones. Cadmium is going to be in the kidneys. Aluminum is going to be in the brain. Mercury is going to be in the heart. Like, there's just no way to know these levels of these specific organs without doing a tissue biopsy, right?
Well, this is the thing. I would love for someone to do a software upgrade for a DEXA machine, the things that we're using to look at bone mineral density,
Yeah.
and actually isolate the individual elements. You could build a 3D map of all the different metals and minerals in tissues, and then you could actually see proper ionomics. You could see what's going on in each of the compartments and organs. So until we have that, at the
Yeah.
moment,
Yeah.
my opinion is the OligoScan is probably the best tool on the market. And I've looked at all of these other, all the other testing. This is my favorite. It's got algorithmic flaws. It's rough around the edges for certain reasons, but
Right.
it is totally disruptive. Like this,
Yeah.
this is like one of the most amazing pieces of technology from a diagnostics perspective.
Yeah. Especially
But it
when you
needs,
use it with blood and urine,
yeah,
because then you can really look at three different
yeah.
vectors of the body and try to connect the dots, which is obviously what we're all trying to do.
Well, this is just it. So when we're looking at the pathway overlay, for example, we get to see that causality. We can see what's happening at the metabolite level at the same time as, seeing what's going on with the mineral cofactors. So being able to actually establish that causality is just something that you can't really do without quality data. And it
Yeah.
becomes really apparent when we're seeing this, what's actually going on.
Yeah.
So anyone that's had questions around the validity of the oligoscan, the output, fair enough. Look, there are steps that probably still need to be taken as far as validation and things to actually,
Yeah.
take that into well, I suppose the mainstream. Um,
Right. No
but
doubt.
you can see literally by looking at the metabolites, and like I've looked at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these in combination, you can definitely establish, you can say, okay, well, if I've got, one metabolite that's high and the one after that is low, and the one in between it has actually got a deficiency showing, this is probably not a good example in this diagram. Um, you can see time and time again that there is a validity to the output, providing, of course, you're using the reinterpretation of the things that are listed as high as actually low. So with that algorithmic correction, it matches really, really neatly. So this report reinterpreter, it does a number of different things. We've also got some extra features. It actually generates a really neat comparison report for up to 5 different reports, and it much like the heat style overlay that we saw in the pathway viewer. It also does the same thing with up to 5 reports. So if you're trying to track over a period of time what things are looking like, you're not limited to just the 2 most recent snapshots.
Yeah.
Um, what I will do is I'll pick yeah, any one of these, I guess.
Yeah. Perfect.
I'll remove names and date of birth. And then, yeah, you can download it as a CSV file if you're trying to do statistics. It's helpful for research. Or you
Okay.
can pull down a PDF, which I'm just going to do here. And you can see this has actually had
Yeah. Perfect.
few hints. And you can also see that with the tool, we have the ability to customize the look and the feel. So the branding, if you wanted to put the clinic, branding logo and things, it allows that to happen.
Uh huh.
And you can also customize the messages and things as well. So there are ways that you can, sort of set it up around the clinic. You can change the footer, images and stuff like it's very customizable. But ultimately,
Perfect.
you can see there's quite a difference. So one of the things we've done is much like the SO check type reports, we've actually removed the absolute values and then converted them into a percentage.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more from a functional perspective. I mean, we don't really care what the actual
Right.
numbers are.
Right.
What we want to see is, yeah, and we need this also as a way to see the heat style map overlay. So that's basically one of the main reasons that it's more important to see it as a percentage deviation rather than an absolute number. The same thing that we do with the organic acid test data and things like that. So this profile to this person, we can see, yeah, I don't actually see. Here we go. Zinc, for example, that's inverted
In it,
high
right?
as low. There's a couple others that are inverted high as low. And the report would then look quite different to the standard report.
Right.
Um, Ultimately, yeah, I think a little bit easier now to sort of see it in this manner. But
Totally. I like it. I mean, it really just highlights the deficiency. I guess my one question would be like, have you ever seen copper toxicity, like a person with copper toxicity, or is that a
very,
byproduct of
very,
something else?
very, very rarely. So it's look in extremely rare cases, and I mean extremely rare cases,
Yeah.
you would see things like the iris rings and things like that. But we're talking like yeah, highly unusual. What I would point to as a counter idea to the idea of copper toxicity in general, I will come back to compartment specific copper toxicity as a
Okay.
possible thing, and that's to do with the cascade. But I would say incredibly rare. Um, is essentially the what is it? It's the copper revolution. I think guy's name is Jason Hommel, and
Yeah.
he has
Yeah.
people taking up to I think it's like 120 milligrams a day of copper.
Yeah.
I've had some people who are doing that protocol pop through and give us some data, and that's like hair and urine and of course the oligoscan data. And I haven't seen any evidence. You see the increased excretion, like significant amounts of copper in the hair, and it's quite a lot in the urine every day. But there's no real buildup. If you have a look in any of the other normal like ceruloplasmin, serum data, oligoscan data, we're not really seeing in between doses. We're not seeing any toxicity. So the body seems to do a particularly good job at actually getting rid of larger amounts of minerals that it needs, unlike the toxic metals, because that requires specific metabolism to actually chelate it and push it out of the cells. And that's why that's different.
Right.
But yeah, the normal copper, zinc, ions, things like that, it does an amazing job of actually getting rid of it. In fact, normally when we see elevations of things like iodine and selenium and other things in the serum, it's actually more relating to transport or metabolic dysfunction further down the line. Like you might see elevated selenol in the serum, like if you're testing,
Yeah.
but that's more indicating that you've got problems with the glutathione peroxidase, or you've got toxic metals, or you've got problems with the methionine type metabolism. So there can be legitimate reasons, but the elevation in the serum doesn't mean they've got toxicity. It just means that they've actually got bottlenecks in processing it.
Right.
Elevated iodine in the serum, for example, might be, low vitamin A or NAD redox issues, meaning that we don't have active vitamin A to then allow the iodide transporters, NIS, to actually pick up the iodide and pull it into the thyroid and other tissues. So that's kind of, you start looking at these as bottlenecks rather than toxicity.
Yeah.
But the toxic metals are a different proposition because ultimately they do end up depositing in cells, and that's
So
largely been speculation, or at
so
least
would
it's
you
suspect.
say would you say low copper, or let's say low copper or inverted copper in your situation? Like, would you correlate low zinc or low copper with liver stagnation at all?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So there's a range of different things. The zinc is so incredibly important.
Yeah.
The zinc, as far as functionality goes, it's in key places for methylation, transsulfuration. It's in the glycolysis pathway at phosphofructokinase. You've got NMDA receptors. It's ubiquitous. So there's like 300 plus reactions that are sensitive to zinc.
Right.
Um, in the disease modeling, it is the differentiator, very, very low zinc is the differentiator between somebody that might be neurodivergent and have certain amounts of mitochondrial dysfunction versus somebody that's got long COVID or, the full collapse, the metabolic collapse. Once the zinc gets really low, all of the rest of the metabolism is highly impaired. That's basically when you fall off the cliff metabolically.
Right.
And then part of that inflammatory cascade that's driving the metal uptake into the brain, the liver, the kidneys, and the spleen is the other side of this. So it becomes essentially a persistent spiral. It becomes something that becomes very difficult to get out of unless you intervene very neatly in a few places at the same time.
Got it. Yeah, and just for the record, I would say anytime I see the zinc high, I immediately know that that is a deficiency. So I guess the
Yeah,
only one where we're not, I guess, in a complete agreement is the high copper. But
yeah.
usually when that copper is high, in your case, you would say that that was is actually low.
Oh,
It still
mhm.
indicates that we need to focus on the liver. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Well,
I think copper and zinc, for the most part, are minerals that people need more of.
yeah. I mean, the way that I look at it is in the body, we store different amounts of different elements. And I would say that oxygen is actually the the most important element. If we don't have enough of that, then we end up quite quite
Yeah,
dead quite quickly.
yeah,
Moving downstream of that, the electrolytes are actually the next most important thing. And then downstream of that, it's yeah, like zinc, copper, iron,
right.
and a range of other things. There is actually, I'm just trying to remember where the table is, but there is actually a list of yeah, different minerals and metals that are affected, and there is a just a small
Yeah,
table of the elements and their mass in the body.
right.
So, roughly speaking, the more of these things that we have in the body, the more sensitive we are to the deficiencies. We can see that we've got quite a lot of phosphorus, for example,
Yeah,
a kilo of phosphorus. The electrolytes are super important. And then progressively, as we're looking down the list, we can see iron, 4 grams roughly, zinc at 2 grams roughly, silicon at 1 gram. And then we start working our way down things. Rubidium's an interesting one. According to the literature, it's not an essential element. And yet, if we don't have enough of it, we have depression and suicide ideation and a bunch of other things.
interesting.
So it might not be essential, but it certainly does make life a lot easier. The interesting thing is that we have like a certain amount of lead, in fact, more lead than copper. That kind of
Yeah,
suggests that the body might be hanging on to it for a particular reason. It's really interesting.
that is really
Um, but perhaps it's just that the data that we've collected too is from modern times where we might be
right.
storing more. So there
Yeah,
might be a bias there
yeah,
too.
that's
It's
true.
hard to know.
It's hard to
But
know.
yeah, progressively as we work our way down through, many of these do actually have specific biological functions. So it's, iodine, of course, we all think of as, being specific for thyroid. Selenium, of course, for thyroid and importantly for the glutathione peroxidase activity and various other things. Chromium for insulin sensitivity. Vanadium's got a similar function as well, so low threshold. And we can see a lot of that. Like there's some of these things that are mentioned here, like on the output of the oligo scan interpretation tool. So there's a discussion here in each of these points. It's like, well, hey, if you see this, it's likely to indicate this. It may infer, tissue specific malfunction or
Yeah,
dysfunction.
yeah, I love
So
your
it's
analysis.
mm.
I love these analyses that you wrote. They're great.
So
Uh,
yeah, I
I
find that oligoscone it's a wonderful tool when harnessed properly.
Yeah, exactly, when you know how to use it and interpret it. Let's talk a little bit about some of these minerals here. Can you talk to me about phosphorus? I mean, I've always been under the assumption that you don't really wanna supplement with phosphorus, that if you're eating milk, cheese, eggs, meat, you're getting enough phosphorus, but do you
No,
supplement with it? Why are so many
yeah,
people low in
absolutely.
it? It's a proxy
Yeah,
for ATP. Maybe just explain it a little bit.
well, okay. So when we're looking at ATP, for the most part, we're actually talking about mg ATP. Let me just change diagrams and or I could use one of these. I'll show you on the subway map.
Okay.
I'll bring up the glycolysis pathway, and it's important because often people struggle trying to get the magnesium up and the phosphate up, and there can be a number of different reasons for that. It can be acidemia as part of this mitochondrial dysfunction spiral, but there can also be interesting issues here. So when we look at phosphate and magnesium, most people are thinking of it as a free ion, but the reality is that when we're looking at the intracellular contents, these are actually bound to different things, different metabolites.
Right.
So ATP is probably one of the larger pools of phosphate, and the Mg is largely bound to that ATP. So Mg ATP ultimately is one of the main ways that we increase the levels of magnesium and phosphate inside the cell. The challenge is that the pathway, other than the mitochondrial electron transport chain, which creates ATP, the other place where it happens is predominantly the glycolysis pathway. So when we're looking at that, the first part of the pathway is actually a net ATP consumer. So we've got glucokinase here, which is an ATP consumer. And then as we get a little bit further, phosphofructokinase, another ATP consumer. And it's not until we actually get after those steps that we get to a net ATP production. So if we've got problems with NAD redox or mitochondrial oxidative stress issues, whatever, complex 1 inhibition, we might have problems at that step. And at which case, we might not actually be picking up the phosphate. So there's two phosphate ions being picked up, and then 1,3-biphosphoglycerates produced. Then we can end up with magnesium being attached to these things. We then end up with more and more lower amounts of magnesium and phosphate in the cell if the glycolysis pathway is inhibited.
Uh-huh.
So in that context, aluminium elevation, zinc
Yeah.
deficiency, these two things can be significant issues as far as actually trying to restore the magnesium and phosphate levels.
Got it.
So there are some neat tricks around that. So one, obviously fix up the constraints. So if they've got elevated aluminium, get rid of that. If we've got low zinc, fix that up. And then there's a little bit more that needs to be done around all that. Oxidative stress issues, obviously, are a big piece. So that's, some of the other metal toxicity and some of the other things. Um,
It really seems like the uh aluminum is one of the most problematic metals.
It is, but it's not in isolation. So it all kind of happens here in tandem. So when we're looking at how dynamic pulses of glucose in the serum end up getting handled,
Mhm.
part of that is like a dynamic regulation via this pathway here. It's called the pentose phosphate pathway, the oxidative pentose phosphate pathway. And so if you could imagine that we get a spike of glucose that converts into glucose 6 phosphate, and then it can go in a few different directions. It can head down into the glycolysis pathway. It
Mhm.
can head over here and try to become glycogen, but there are certain things here that are going to regulate that. One of these steps is actually this UGPase activity, and that needs, much like ATP, it actually is UTP, so uridine triphosphate. And to
Mhm.
make uridine triphosphate, there are some steps, and some of that can come from orotic acid and nitrogen and things. Let me just find some of that. I'm not going to dive into that too far. You can see this person's got highly dysregulated ability to produce UTP. So from
Yeah.
one route is uracil through to uridine, uridine monophosphate, diphosphate, triphosphate. So we can see that if we have high uracil, low uridine, then we might have low, ribose 1 phosphate. So you're like, okay, well, what's going on with that? If we go and have a look at that metabolism, the pentose phosphate pathway here produces R1P and it produces PRPP. So we can see even at a glance here, hey, look, R5P is actually low. So if R5P is low, we can say R1P is going to be low and PRPP is going to be low,
Right.
regardless of whatever else is going on. So then you'd ask the question, well, hang on a minute, how did R5P get low? Even the D-ribose is not converting into R5P, which is another route. And so at that point, we'd say, okay, well, maybe we've got low magnesium. Well, yes, we do. Maybe we've got low, phosphate. Well, yes, we do. Spoiler alert, we can see that from both the therium data and we can see that from the oligoscan data. And then you'd say, well, okay, well, what's going on with that? How did that state, happen? And then we can start looking at this and say, well, if we have dysregulation, we actually have high levels of glutathione in the reduced state. So, well, what's going on that might be creating a problem? You go, well, we have this NADP redox here. And the NADP redox, it has a partnership essentially between the glutathione metabolism and this pentose phosphate pathway metabolism. So G6PD that people might know of for different reasons. And G6PD is one of the rare mutations in autism, but it is significantly affected by high levels of aluminium. So if we've
Right.
accumulated aluminium through the placenta, and then we might accumulate a whole range of additional aluminium through, childhood vaccination schedule, for example. I'm in the middle of authoring a paper on that at the moment, but that was actually quite interesting. It actually looks like the levels of aluminium that come via the injection schedule is basically doubles the amount of the tissue aluminium. So
Right.
if there's not enough silica and zinc and things like that to allow the metabolism to actually push it back out again, hypothetically, it appears to be accumulating, and that's what we see in the oligoscan data.
Yep.
So it's one of the routes I think towards how some of these elevations could occur. But the good news is that we now have some really neat tools in actually clearing out the aluminium and the other toxic metals. So these things can turn around in a matter of days and weeks. So it's all a little bit exciting.
Yeah.
Um, so here. here at the NADP redox, if we have problems with aluminium, if we have problems with cadmium and lead, or if we have problems on the other side of glutathione metabolism with silver and with mercury, then we end up with this challenge with the NADP redox. There's also a problem if we have low magnesium and phosphate as MgATP, because to convert NAD, which may already be low, into NADP, then there's NAD kinase, which needs MgATP.
Uh-huh.
So if we have, this is just a Therium Aristotle classic. If I bring up one of the plus ones, we actually get direct measures, and I'm tempted to actually do that. But the level of the amount of NAD versus the amount of NADP is highly dependent on the activity of this NAD kinase. And so if we have low ATP and low Mg, it's quite possible that the total pool size here of the NADP, swapping back and forth between the two states, is going to be low. I'm tempted to, just because we are,
Yeah, do it.
yeah. Uh,
But Joshua, do you think that you get, if you're eating milk, egg, cheese, and meat, are you getting enough phosphorus by and large, or do you need to
no.
supplement with it as well?
I think if you have problems with the glycolysis pathway, you're going to struggle to turn that dietary phosphate into into intracellular phosphate.
Okay, got it.
So my favorite way of trying to replenish the phosphate levels at the moment, there's actually a magnesium glycerophosphate,
Yeah,
and
I take
you
it.
dose that sublingually. It is really impressive. So
Yeah.
what's different with that is that, unlike being free ions of phosphate and magnesium that you would normally consume in food or another supplement, if you're taking this sublingually, it actually drops into that glycolysis pathway as an already phosphorylated metabolite. So if you've got problems with the glycolysis pathway, hypothetically, this is able to sidestep that and allow you to get the levels of the phosphate up much more easily.
Interesting. So it's a sublingual.
Hmm.
Is it a liquid?
If you No, it's a powder.
You just
There's a
break
few
it open
different.
and hold it under your tongue?
Yeah, that's basic, and it's interesting. It's actually warm. If you stick it in the mouth, as the saliva hits that, it's actually warm. And then some people report that they can feel the whole body becoming warm after actually after
Wow.
taking it.
That's really
So
interesting.
yeah, it is really interesting. So here's a good example. We now have, okay, via this data, we now have direct measures. So this person was actually taking a sublingual NAD supplement. So
Uh-huh.
the interesting thing is we can actually see they have high levels of NAD, but they have even higher levels of NADH. So
Uh-huh.
in other words, the total pool is okay, but the redox is faulty. And that goes back to that oxidative stress and, complex 1 inhibition and things. But we can see conversely, even though we've got very high levels of NAD and NADH, we actually have very low levels. Look at that, negative 700% levels of
Wow.
NADP and NADPH.
Yeah.
So that gives us a pretty clear indication that our conversion here at NAD kinase is actually a problem. And we can see, if we actually look at the ATP, a direct measure of the ATP here, negative 80%. And the magnesium coming out of the oligoscan, not the worst. It's negative 25%, certainly seen, significantly worse. So it looks like the phosphate deficiency in this case is like one of the real causal factors in a lot of this metabolism being poor. So
Interesting.
then we go back to, yeah. So then we look at that and say, okay, well, hey, what's happening with that? What's going on with the glutathione metabolism? And now, again, in this Therium Aristotle plus, we can get direct measures of the reduced glutathione versus the oxidized glutathione state. So we can see, look, it's actually building up as oxidized glutathione, which is then saying, well, why would it build up there? You say, well, hang on a minute. We just saw a moment ago that the NADP pool is 700% lower, approximately, than it should be. So it really is going to be then dependent on the partnership between here, glutathione reductase, and what's happening at G6PD. So there could be, yep, definitely some cadmium issues there that could be, creating problems for glutathione reductase. However, I suspect if we're going to have a look at the G6PD and 6PGD, well, yeah, there's a bit of aluminium, but not the worst. So it does look like the cadmium is probably the larger signal there for this person.
And this is obviously built up cadmium in the tissue from the oligoscan. But I mean, cadmium is a really hard one because it's everywhere, like
Yeah,
aluminum.
it is. Yeah, it really is. Look, we get exposed to trace amounts of it in food and everything else all day, every day. And normally the body does a pretty good job of actually clearing that back out again, up until the point where it can't. And that's, again, the low minerals. If you've got low zinc, problems with methylation, transsulfuration, whatever else is going on, your ability to produce glutathione is going to be impaired, which means that it doesn't push the metals back out again and allow the body to clear it. It's that the depositing of these metals and the accumulation is where this becomes progressive.
Right.
So
Can we okay, I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk more about some of these minerals that I see low in a lot of people. Talk to me
mhm,
about iodine, maybe high iodine in the blood or a
yeah,
low iodine on the oligo scan.
well, absolutely. So look, iodine. Let me actually. I'll show you the vitamin A metabolism because that's kind of the most important thing when we're talking about iodine. Um, So if we were to look at vitamin A metabolism, it's highly dependent on that NAD redox to actually jump between the different forms. So we start off at some sort of storage form, the retinol ester. We then get to the alcohol type form, so retinol. We then get converted into the aldehyde form, so retinal. And then we go to the acetate type form, which is the retinoic acid. And there's different forms of that. So we've got, for example, 9-cis retinoic acid, which activates different receptors versus all trans-retinoic acid, which activates other receptors. And then downstream of that, we end up with different pathways, which are then either gated or promoted or whatever based on that activation. So what that means is that if somebody has a vitamin A deficiency, they're going to have problems with the NIS transporter, which is the iodide uptake.
Uh-huh.
Um, However, also, if they've got problems with the NAD redox, in other words, if they've got toxic metals and things that are messing up the glutathione metabolism and creating mitochondrial oxidative stress issues, that complex 1 inhibition, which is the thing that converts the NADH back to NAD under normal circumstances, is not working particularly well, which means that this whole pathway is not working particularly well, as you can directly see in
Yeah.
this data. So the ability to activate the iodide transporter and uptake into the tissue is going to be problematic when we have oxidative stress, when we have these metals and other issues.
Right.
So if you want to get the iodide working, or iodide into the tissue, one, make sure the dietary vitamin A is present, and then two, fix the issues that are inhibiting the mitochondrial metabolism. So the main one here, if I go back to Figure 14. Doo-doo-doo. In this case, we can see the dysfunction very clearly in this one. And there's a really interesting piece, and this is, relating to autism spectrum and everything else. I'll come back to that with the glutamate in a moment.
Yeah.
We can see here that when the TCA cycle ends up getting inhibited, we can see some of that as patterns here, but we can see that the NADH primarily is elevated, and the NADH being elevated is because complex 1, which is supposed to take these electrons, so take the H, put the electrons through the electron transport chain, ultimately power up the pump, ATP synthase eventually, and then restore the normal levels of NAD. That's not happening. And so if complex 1 is inhibited, it then basically pushes that pressure, if you like, through other enzymes. So we see glutamate dehydrogenase, right? So that means that we see more glutamate, and that's inside the cells at that point, right? That's not outside the cells. That's not acting as a signal to pull the calcium into into the cells until adrenaline comes along and activates CMPKA and triggers the export of that glutamate out into the cerebral spinal fluid and then causes that calcium influx. So that's the excitotoxicity. That's the visual and audio
Right.
overstimulation, intolerance, et cetera, et cetera. So you're taking a cell which has already got mitochondria that are overloaded, right? They've already reached a point that there's too much, oxidative stress. There's no NAD redox. Everything's kind of shutting down, and then that glutamate gets exported, turns into a calcium influx, and then overdrives an already overdriven cell. So that's essentially a big piece of the puzzle as far as the calcium channel dysregulation. And then you start seeing compensations like was it the TRPN3 inhibition and various other things.
Yeah.
Now, when that NADH pool elevation is a problem, it's still like the metabolism tries to compensate, and so it might end up as lactate, it might end up as glutamate, it might end up as glycerol, all of the above, depending on how problematic the NAD redox is overall. So you start seeing that compensation. There are some other things that jump into the lactate metabolism. You'll see that in Figure 12, prolyl hydroxylases, fault, fault sensing and things like that. But you'll see that the lactate generation is one of the ways that the NADH can be converted back into NAD, right? It's the other NAD redox related enzymes.
Right.
So hyperoxaluria, lactate, and glutamate are probably some of the big endpoints you can see. Glycerol, when you have any of those things being elevated, it'll show up that way. But yeah, so that's basically the main piece. So if we have toxic metals, if we have low selenium, if we have low zinc, if we have dietary folate insufficiency, and there's reasons that, folate might not be getting converted into the active forms and methylation ends up being inhibited. Some of that's to do with this NADPH and NADP redox. Some of that's to do with dietary insufficiency. There's a number of different things. There's some other influences from the microbiome and acetaldehyde and various other things.
Would that also be the case, or one of the reasons why you see low B9 and low zinc almost always together?
Oh, almost always together. Let me show you that because I think that's a really interesting one.
Yeah,
Let me
almost
just show you
always.
the almost always, almost always.
Yeah,
Look, basically, the transporters for folate or folic acid into the cells require calcium, zinc, and thiamine pyrophosphate. So the active form of B1. There are various reasons why B1 can get low in this cascade, and it's to do with the microbiome and the acetaldehyde. But if you have a look at this, let's just look at these steps. So you can see dietary folate up here on the right.
uh-huh,
And then you
yep,
can see zinc is required at that transporter, active B1, TPP at the next. Now we're inside the cell here. And that first step, DHFR, that needs magnesium, but it's driven by the NADPH to NADP. Then the same enzyme again, so from folate to DHF to THF. THF, we're now in the cycle. But to get through these first few steps, if we've got low zinc, ba-bong. If we've got
yeah,
problems with magnesium and manganese, problem. If we've got problems with that NADPH redox, problem. So all of those steps mean that we get low THF. And then from low THF, depending on what's going on with the glycolysis pathway, and there's a little sensor pathway coming off glycolysis, that gives us, if we have, in this case, it's a great example because this is actually shut down here. Whoops. Um, if we have higher levels of glycine than we do of serine, then we end up with inhibited cycles. So that's basically a regulatory input. So if serine is low, and it will be for various reasons, serine basically is a sensor relay for a number of pathways, including the methylation. So if glycolysis is impaired, if there's NAD redox issues, whatever, I can show you how this works if you like. Then
yeah,
you end up with methylation being inhibited. Um, the way that works, the way serine works here, coming off the glycolysis pathway. So basically, we start off with 3-phosphoglycerate down here. So to get elevated 3-phosphoglycerate means that we've either got a bottleneck like this one does here. We can
yeah,
see this building up, but we've still got 3-phosphoglycerate. And then it actually goes through just a couple of sensor steps. So there's a dehydrogenase here, which needs NAD, working NAD redox. Clearly, that's a problem here, and that's actually the bottleneck. It then goes through the next step. That needs elevated glutamate relative to alpha ketoglutarate, which we definitely have at this moment. So that step would be working. Ultimately, we get to the point where serine ends up being low. So if serine is low, what that means is that a number of other places that need that serine activation are going to be a problem. So we can see that the activation, the glycolysis pathway, and that is actually the bottleneck here, is not happening. So pyruvate kinase M2 is being inhibited by the low serine, also the low fructose 1,6-biphosphate. So that means that that PEP here at the end of the glycolysis pathway is not ending up as pyruvate that we can see is actually low here in blue.
yeah,
So we've got a very clear bottleneck for that. Similarly, the low serine is going to affect a few other places. So we can just see how we've got these pink arcs
yeah,
here of metabolites.
yep.
So we can see that one of those is going to be SHNT here in the methylation, and then from transsulfuration, CBS over here is also another serine activation.
So the serine
So
is created?
yeah, serine is created largely by the branch off the glycolysis pathway. So
Okay,
in that context, it is a sensor. So if there are various faults, we get low serine, and then that basically shuts down these other pathways and gives things a time to catch up and sort of stabilize.
got it. So in terms of vitamin A, B9, zinc,
Hmm.
are you a fan of eating organ meats like liver?
Yeah, that's a useful source. I mean, I'm personally a vegetarian, but don't hold that against me.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
certainly, from a nutritional standpoint, yeah, organ meats are a great source of, yeah, a number of nutrients.
Do you think these companies that are putting the liver in the pill form, do you think they're as absorbable as the real thing?
It's tricky. I mean, a lot of these things are um, lipid based. So yeah, in a powdered form, possibly less. That said, look, I've seen people have some great responses to the powdered liver supplements.
Yeah.
So, I wouldn't say don't do it. I just think it's, maybe it's even if it's 50% as effective as the actual original source, it's still going to be better than not having it all.
Right, right. Are you Since you're a vegetarian, are you taking a lot of things like zinc, via supplementation or no?
No, very, very few supplements actually. A little bit of magnesium every now and again, but that's largely because of my training volume and things like that. And look, the vegetarian diet, excuse me, vegetarian diet can be, not so amazing in magnesium and a few other things. But yeah, by and large, look, a little bit of vitamin D every now and again and some magnesium, and that's about it. Some pre-workout.
Yeah. Have you always been vegetarian, or what was the
Yeah, I
genesis
got
of
raised
you?
by a bunch of barefoot naked hippies. So yeah,
I love
yeah,
it.
both parents are naturopaths. So yeah, um, yeah, anyway, my
Got it.
childhood
Okay,
is
cool.
that.
Okay,
Yeah,
this is
that was one
great.
thing I decided they were right on, actually. I stayed vegetarian after trying meats in my teenage years, and I don't know, just body didn't like it, and I just ideologically didn't gel with it. So
Is your blood type A?
no, I'm an O.
You're an O. Okay, interesting. Interesting. Okay, very cool. Well, this has been great. I'm trying to think any other ones I want to talk about. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit.
Hmm.
One one case that I see a lot of times is, let's say it's a woman, let's say she's in her 40s or 50s. Let's
Hmm.
say she's 30 to 50 pounds overweight.
Hmm.
Um, she can't lose the weight. It's very hard.
Yeah,
Her iodine's low. I'll
yeah,
often see her antimony high.
yeah,
And every now and then, usually I'll see that she's got mercury toxicity from an amalgam.
yeah.
My question for you is, like, thinking through like logical explanations as to, okay, why is the body holding on to this excess weight? Could it be because of a mercury filling in the mouth for 20, 30 years? The body got to a point where it couldn't keep up with excreting the metal out of the body. I'm
Hmm.
guessing likely the liver got compromised, the excretion pathways got compromised to a point where it said, okay, we got to do something with this metal. We're going to put it in the fat tissue. And do you think that could be a main reason as to why the woman is having a hard time losing the weight because the detox pathways are blocked? Is the
Well, I
root
think
cause the
realistically,
mercury?
I think, look, the mercury is likely to be one of the big pieces there. But if you consider what's going to happen with the mercury versus the selenium. So if you look at the thyroid pathway, I haven't got that diagram handy to show you at the moment, but if you look at the thyroid pathway, apart from the transporters and a bit of MGATP and an NAK ATPase, the next steps are there's iodine base, so that's the T4 synthesis, and then the T4 to T3 is largely the selenium. So the mercury kicks the selenium off the enzymes that are needing that selenium. So glutathione peroxidase and what is it, the 3-iodoxin or whatever the other one is in the thyroid. So the mercury is going to create functional issues for T3, which is then going to affect a lot of the metabolism. So one of the important places that T3 sits is actually in the regulation of gluconeogenesis.
Uh-huh.
So that's PepCK up here. But ultimately, it's the T3 regulates a number of different things. So low thyroid is well known for creating problems with weight management, but it's likely not to be the only thing. The interesting thing is that if you're seeing that problem with the thyroid function, you can expect the same things to be happening in other tissues, right? So the metal distribution is also going to be affecting liver, right? It's going to be affecting a number of other things. When we look at the lipolysis and then the fatty acid transport and oxidation, what's really interesting with that is that there is another regulator. So from lipolysis or dietary intake of fatty acids, they end up with these different length chains. So the short ones, and some of those are bioactive in different ways, they can just get straight through the membrane. The longer chain fatty acids, they need an active transport, right? They need this carnitine shuttle. Now, to make carnitine, to allow that carnitine shuttle to work, it actually has, interestingly enough, it's kind of like a series of circuit breakers. So the carnitine synthesis pathway, pretty simple pathway, but look, we have these two hydroxylase steps here, and they take alpha ketoglutarate as a substrate, and they produce succinate. So the same as the prolyl hydroxylases, which we haven't talked about, which are acting as a fault sensor for the citric acid cycle. So if we've got problems with the TCA cycle, and that's largely going to be oxidative stress or sometimes low magnesium and various other things going on, then we can expect these two steps to be problematic, which means that we're going to have low carnitine. If we've got oxidative stress, we've also got another sensor here. If there's low vitamin C, from straight up overuse of the antioxidants, then we'll end up with low carnitine. If we've got low iron, which a lot of people are going to because of this inflammatory cascade, then we're going to end up with a bias towards low carnitine. So that's low iron is going to affect your ability to oxidize or transport and oxidize fatty acids. So then we go back to the NAD redox here. So again, if we've got complex 1 inhibition from oxidative stress, then we end up with this step being inhibited. So this pathway is incredibly sensitive to mitochondrial dysfunction and then low carnitine. And then that means that we're not transporting the fatty acids into the mitochondria to get oxidized.
Right.
So it's regulatory. So this is why people might find carnitine, for example, helpful as a supplement to help get energy and help weight loss, for example. But ultimately, if we take a step back and say, well, why is the carnitine low? Then we end up going back, all roads leading to Rome. We end up looking again at the metabolism for the oxidative stress. We go and have a look at see what's actually going to be inhibiting the TCA cycle and the feeder pathways. And that's when we're going to see, okay, well, we've got various different things that are low. We've got various, low minerals, various elevated metals, and then ultimately mitochondrial dysfunction. So taking a big step back from it all, again, it's the same process. Put the minerals in, take the metals out, get the systems working again, and then homeostasis gets restored. And a lot of that time, once we now get functional thyroid and functioning liver, then yeah, you can expect that the weight is going to shift, probably
Yeah.
without a whole lot of effort at that point.
And just real quick, to what extent do you think antimony is impacting the endocrine system and making it hard? Is that impacting the iodine as well?
Hypothetically, look, antimony does a range of different things. I've seen it indicated for collagen synthesis and degradation. Admittedly, it's one that I haven't studied in enough detail to give you a good answer on.
Okay.
But yeah, if you want, I can get back to you on that one and see
Yeah,
if
yeah,
there's
yeah.
any other functions.
Yeah, I
But
was just
yeah,
curious.
yeah, you've got me curious. But yeah, from what I've seen, it does have ability to affect the collagen synthesis and degradation. So hypothetically, it would have to have a similar impact. The collagen synthesis and degradation also comes off this same TCA cycle set of dysregulation. So if we have a look here, to see on the left, we've got collagen synthesis degradation. So this is like the tissue repair.
Yeah.
It has direct flow through these prolyl hydroxylases. The prolyl hydroxylases are acting as fault sensors, which then switch on the anaerobic glycolysis, so the lactic acid metabolism, when the TCA cycle is inhibited, or again, much like what we saw in the carnitine synthesis pathway, when there's oxidative stress and other things that are going wrong. The interesting thing is, in addition to triggering the lactic acid metabolism, it also happens to be one of the main triggers to reactivate the herpes viruses and HPV and HIV. So when you have this mitochondrial dysfunction, it ends up creating a chronic viral reactivation state. So while antivirals might be helpful in kind of dealing with some of the lytic cells, ultimately, if you want to get rid of this chronic reactivation, it means actually correcting the mitochondrial dysfunction. So that means, correcting the TCA cycle, dealing with the oxidative stress issues, fixing up the glutathione metabolism, and actually getting all of this to work. As soon as you can get the fault sensing to stop being tripped all the time, the sooner all of this stuff starts working. So the sooner you can start doing tissue repair, collagen synthesis, and everything else. So if antimony happens to be able to create problems with the collagen synthesis and degradation, hypothetically, and I haven't studied it well enough to give you any kind of evidence-based answer. Hypothetically, I could infer that it's likely to have a similar effect on some of this metabolism.
Okay, got it. All right, this is a good segue for our next topic. Let's talk about how do we get the metals out of the body. Let's talk about chelation. Let's talk about some of your new findings with some promising results.
Yeah. So, okay. Traditionally, one of the big issues with chelation has been that most of the tools that were available either did too broad a job, so they pull out the minerals at the same time as the metals, or they're not lipophilic and they don't get into the cells to actually pull the metals out, and they're only cleaning up what's in the serum. So that's been a challenge. The way that I've traditionally approached that is to get the glutathione metabolism working first. In other words, fix up the methylation, transsulfuration, get the glutathione metabolism, and then slowly chip away at these metals. Add silica into the system and get rid of the aluminium. That basically allows you a gentle route towards restoring all of this. Happily, Happily, I've only been made aware of in the last few months a new chelator. It's the second generation, got some here actually, second generation of DMSA, which was a popular one that's not lipophilic. So this is a product which is available. And what I've seen is in even just a handful of doses, I've seen it rapidly shift the a large array of the different toxic metals out of the system. So you'll see the aluminium, the lead, the mercury, the cadmium, the quite a range of others dropping. Tin, everything basically is dropping in the oligoscan data, even just within a few doses.
Yeah.
I've seen profound shifts in the metabolism in kids with autism, for example.
Yeah.
With even just like the first couple of doses, it's phenomenal,
Wow.
phenomenal. So it's something that I would highly recommend having a look at.
Yeah.
There are a few things that are important to know around sort of that collation. If it works, and it does, um, it will correct this NADP redox, which means that it corrects the glucose metabolism, the glycolysis, which means that if people have adapted to a lower carb diet, because this dysfunction actually creates quote unquote insulin sensitivity,
Yeah.
insensitivity issues. So because of that, people tend to do better with a lower carb diet during that state. If you rapidly correct that metabolism, the body then starts switching over to using glycolysis again, which means that you have to go and refill these glycogen stores.
Right.
And so that means switching to a higher carb diet, and that might be like 250 grams of net carbs or more a day. And there's likely to be some kind of glycogen refill event, like having run a marathon or switching from a ketogenic diet, where
Right.
you've got very low glycogen reserves. It means that you actually have to go through a carb loading phase to build the reserves back up. So that's kind of the transition. And the other big piece is that because the immune cells, as the immune cells are particularly sensitive to glycolysis and glutaminolysis, you see a rapid shift in the immune activity. And so, one of the things that this model talks about is essentially immunological debt or incomplete healing. So, we end up with these reservoirs of all these different pathogens and tissue that hasn't repaired properly and everything else because of
Right.
the limitations and constraints. When you correct this metabolism, you get glycolysis working, you'll see the body go on a bit of a tour of all of the old historical infections that maybe you thought were clear or maybe not.
Right.
And you see the immune system clearing those up quite actively. And that can be rashes, joint pain, can be
Right.
fever, can be all kinds of different things. But the immune system doesn't seem to really care about our emotional state or our comfort, but it does a really good job once it's working of actually kicking out the invaders.
Okay, this is a complete side note. I'm going to come back to this conversation because that just made me realize that dry fasting. There was a Russian doctor, Sergey Filanov, who talks about dry fasting and how after 3 or 4 days of dry fasting, you'll start craving foods that you craved like 20 years ago, and that the dry fasting creates autophagy. Blah 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 blah. What are your thoughts on dry fasting? And then we'll come back to the DMSA.
Um, I think it's tricky. I've done a lot with water fasting. I think dry fasting maybe has some additional potential benefits, but I think it's challenging, and I think it needs to be done under medical supervision.
Yeah,
Um, I suspect you'd probably get as good results out of water fasting
yeah,
with maybe a lower risk profile.
right. Right. Okay. Okay. I just had to ask you. Okay. Let's go back to the DMSA. Um,
Mm.
the thing with chelation that I've always heard is that you run the risk of redistributing the metals to other parts of the body and putting too much stress on the kidneys. Does this,
Yeah,
does this, does this counter those negative
I think.
effects?
Look, I think this comes from the Andy Cutler legacy,
Yeah.
and The thing with that is that there's this big boogeyman of redistribution of the metals, and I think it's a very simplistic view of how the metal transport works. What I might do is actually just bring up figure 12 and we can talk about this with a little more nuance. The short answer is that no, it's not really a concern. You'll see basically the metal transport and redistribution is going to happen. But if for argument's sake, 80% of the metals that are collated are excreted and 20% end up being deposited again, it's not really, much of a concern because the next dose picks up that, residue plus, the additional metals that are still in the system. And that overall process, that trend becomes a net positive, a
Right.
highly positive, process. So if there's some settling and redistribution, it's not really a problem. I'd be more probably thinking of redistribution to the liver more than the kidneys in with this, and you might notice that initially as maybe an LDL bump, as which is part of the NAD redox issues. You might see that in the initial phase, like while
Yeah.
while you do the first few doses. But by the time you're getting, say like 10 doses through, or at least five, you're likely to see all of that shifting quite significantly. It's a rapid effect. So I've seen via just the feedback from people using this product within 1 to 2 weeks, gigantic leaps forward in the metabolism.
Yeah.
So it's something that would have taken, probably a year of very patient and consistent dosing to manage the minerals and get everything up is replaced with just a handful of pills
And a
in a
lot
week or two.
and a lot of these metals, leaving the body? Through the bile? Through the
Well, it's some of it's going to be via the gut and some of that's going to be via the urine.
Okay. I got it. And then is there anything that you would take with this? Like any other, like, Pectosol, any binders or
Funny you should mention that. Actually, yeah. So I mentioned in the protocol. Let me just jump into that. So modified citrus pectin is something I've mentioned as a kind of like a lightweight binder.
yeah. Oh, and you actually added this chelating agent to the protocol?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. This is
Yeah.
officially in the protocol.
Okay, cool.
So it's in the getting started at the same point. So it's after I'll just step through it just so conceptually taking a big step back. So pacing, getting the exertion to match the capacity, lymphatic flow, because as soon as you start fixing the metabolism, the immune system starts picking fights, and then the lymph can end up clogging the lymph nodes, and then you end up with compartmentalized problems. So it could be intracranial pressure, it could be a number of different things.
Right.
So that needs to be maintained. The carbohydrate intake needs to match the metabolism, and then we work on the minerals and the metals, and then ultimately the cardiovascular issues, making sure that there's nothing further there. And that can be like thoracic outlet syndrome, that can be cranial instability and things that might be affecting the nervous system. And then also nasal dysbiosis, which can affect the nervous system signaling and parasympathetic signaling. So that's the overview. But then partway through this, so when we're looking at the minerals and metals, after having done a number of the other things like the electrolytes and working with thyroid and blah, 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 antioxidants, we then get to this point and yeah, Pectosol on the days that we're doing the collation around meal times is actually something that can be quite helpful in catching some of that psyllium husk. I think could be
Yeah.
also kind of useful. You could also think about bentonite and charcoal and things like that, well away from everything else. So like
Yeah.
end of day thing because that's kind of a bit broad.
Right.
Uh, yeah. The vendor for this Dazomet product, if I'm pronouncing that right, they also recommend Dota. So their product called Captomet, which is not really it's not really selective. It's the reason I haven't like recommended it here in the protocol. I think that the unicorn status that this Dazomet or Mia DMSA provides is because it is so selective. I
Right.
think that you lose that if you use a broad another chelator like the Dota on top of that. I think would be in some people a bit problematic. Like you end up basically getting rid of the things that you're trying to keep.
Got it.
So I prefer the Pectosol option as a softer route towards actually enhancing the other sort of metal excretion. And there's good data on that in the literature. So I think it is a sensible route. People that have got really high levels of lead and mercury, for example, I think the Pectosol is probably going to be a better option to add in there. But I don't, in many cases, it's just not necessary.
Okay, got it. Now, the only other thing I didn't see in this protocol is sauna. Do you recommend sauna use?
Tricky. Yes and no. So the sauna is going to promote histamine and it's going to promote oxidative stress. Once you've done enough work with the metal detox and you've actually got working ROS metabolism, so reactive oxygen species metabolism, sauna, great, absolutely useful. In the early stages, while you're still trying to stabilize things, particularly for really sick patients, no.
Okay, got it.
Wildly inappropriate. It promotes the immune activity and the oxidative stress that basically the system doesn't support. But later, absolutely, it's a lovely thing once you get a bit further into working metabolism.
So for somebody that doesn't have that's not going through a lot of deep issues, they would be
General
okay with it.
population, right?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, got it. Okay, got it. Um, I guess my last question is any concern about like would you take any kind of kidney or liver support during this? Like any kind of bitters or
Well, look, interestingly enough, one thing that I've seen, the response to the chelators, people that have got highly dysregulated catecholamine, so like the noradrenaline and adrenaline, if they've been too far into sympathetic for a while, the receptors potentially can become downregulated, they lose sensitivity. If you rapidly correct that pathway, then it's kind of like rapidly coming off an antidepressant, so they can be, a bit anhedonic tone. Conversely, if they're the other way and they're kind of more on the depressive side, some people end up with temporary euphoria. So one way or the other, the pathway corrects, and then there's kind of like a rebound. Um, for the anhedonic tone, something that has been kind of helpful is astaxanthin and silymarin. So the liver, essentially things that might promote NRF2, which is going to help with the oxidative stress, and astaxanthin, which has its powerful antioxidant functions. I
right?
think those can be quite helpful. I'm actually considering officially, increasing some of the antioxidant support that we do actually include before we start working on the minerals and metals anyway.
Got
So
it.
there's already things in there, but ultimately, I think yeah, Silymarin and astaxanthin are sensible, supports during that time if you've got significant issues.
And I'm under the assumption that you're probably in agreement with this statement, but you don't like to take glutathione. The body produces glutathione.
It's tricky. Um, okay, so yeah, glutathione,
It's a
if
band-aid, right? It's a
it's
patch.
a band-aid. It doesn't fix the problem. And there are potential concerns if you've got somebody that might have, for example, cancer, glutathione is like rocket fuel for that.
Yeah.
Fixing the metabolism instead, so correcting the precursors, is a different situation. I mean, and ultimately, you want to correct the precursors. Like, if you've got problems with the glycine synthesis, it doesn't just affect the glutathione synthesis. You've already then going to have problems with the glutamate, the elevated glutamate inside the cells, and then the export via the adrenaline cascade. But the glycine is one of the things that is required to modulate the NMDA receptors that the glutamate actually agonizes.
Mhm.
So it's better to restore the upstream pathways and restore the glutathione metabolism than it is to just add glutathione. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying ultimately the goal is to get that homeostasis back.
Got it. Yeah, I agree. Okay, I wanna give you a little antidote here. So, I've been taking high dose bempothiamine and TTFD,
Hmm.
and I've done 2 experiments where I've been taking it and then I stopped for 2 weeks. I've been taking it and I stopped for 2 weeks. Um, my sulfur level, I genuinely struggle with sulfur on the oligoskin.
Hmm.
After taking it twice, it's jumped
Hmm.
up significantly. It's been
Yeah,
a
it
huge
will.
help for me.
Yeah, so the logic behind that is that sulfur is used as part of the oxalate transport. So if you, for example, let's say that you've got low B1 for various reasons, and if I can actually throw the diagram back in and I'll show you how that works,
Yeah.
then that's going to affect pyruvate dehydrogenase. It's going to affect alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase. It's going to affect the non-oxidative pentose phosphate pathway. And so when that happens, you're going to end up with lactic acid metabolism and oxalates elevation. So that oxalate elevation is going to tax the sulfur in the process of exporting it. So you then end up with lower sulfur. So if you then correct the B1 deficiency, that allows the TCA cycle to be working, which then means that you're not, producing the oxalate, which then allows the sulfur levels to get back up again.
Do you also recommend if you're taking B1, especially in high doses, to add in B2 riboflavin?
Well, the question is why you're taking any of them in the first place. So
Yeah.
maybe let me bring up another diagram.
I would say to help with the sulfurs, which is a proxy for glutathione.
Mm. But I think what'll be really useful is to show you. Let me just bring up
Yeah.
one of the diagrams. And this is essentially how via zinc deficiency and how via microbiome cascade, so the fermentation syndrome, you can end up with a number of different things. Let me just share screen again. Let's see if I can make that clear. So hopefully we can see this. So
Yeah.
B1, the active form is thiamine pyrophosphate. So when you have problems with acetaldehyde, so either you're an alcoholic or you've got microbiome that is it's adapting around sympathetic excess, perhaps, and it's producing acetaldehyde, and the acetaldehyde then triggers the body to produce opioids, which then balances out the elevated C-AMP-PKA from the sympathetic pathway. The acetaldehyde has an impact on so many things. I mean, we know from alcoholism studies that it creates malnutrition. Mechanistically, one of the things that it does is to act to form an adduct with thiamine,
Uh-huh.
and so basically you can actually test. It's really interesting. You'll see often elevated levels of B1 in the serum, but it's not actually bioavailable because it's bound. It's creating an adduct with the acetaldehyde. And so you still have a functional B1 deficiency
Yeah.
while having apparently normal levels of thiamine or elevated levels of thiamine. So you can then go and megadose, different forms of B1 to kind of just brute force through that problem, but ultimately you need to go upstream and say, well, what's going on with that?
Yeah.
Um, Similarly, via the zinc deficiency cascade, this combination of things, this basically runs the whole system down. So just simplifying around the zinc, you can see the downstream effects. If you trace your way through this, we affect methylation. We end up with low FAD. We end up with low P5P, coenzyme A number of important amino acids and other things. We end up with the NAD redox issues. We end up with low retinoic acid, what we talked about before with the iodide uptake. And we end up with low coenzyme Q10 synthesis via combinations of these things. So ultimately, yeah, you can take all of these different B vitamins and try to, basically prop all these pathways up. But the goal is to actually fix the constraints that
Right.
are upstream to creating these issues in the first place.
And that's really where it's useful to have the oligo scan in comparison with the blood work.
You can see it. That's the thing. You get to see the what and the why,
Yeah.
right? You get that causality. And then, if you then understand some of the constraints and challenges and actually resolving some of these issues, you can do things in a very efficient way to remove those constraints and to, affect the repletion. So if you've probably noticed, like when I'm approaching this normally, when I look at the oligoscan data and I see, for example, low magnesium and phosphate and sulfur, I know that that mitochondrial dysfunction is present, right? So that whether or not that's the hypoxia cascade, whether or not it's the metals, like whatever is basically creating that situation, I need to work on that first because
Right.
otherwise, trying to get all the other minerals and things up is just going to be throwing things at a wall and not really having much success. So that's the focus. Getting that part working. The trouble is to get that working, you might have to get the zinc up, and that's going to be challenging. In the cascade, one of the things that we see, and I can probably just scroll down. One of the things that we see is via this inflammatory cascade, the oral absorption via the gut, via the duodenum, is impaired. So non-oral routes, so sublingual, liposomal, DMSO, various other things, are a way that you can get these minerals into the system bypassing that chronic inflammatory cascade. So that is one of the things. But yeah, again, getting the electrolytes under control first, getting the metals out, all of those things are going to be helpful, very, very helpful in actually allowing you to get the mineral levels up. If you try to do it in the wrong order, you could waste 6 or 12 months and
Right.
spend a lot of time and money and not get anywhere.
And what are the other besides alcohol consumption, what are the other causes for low acetaldehyde?
Oh, the high levels of acetaldehyde. So
Yeah.
it's a fermentation syndrome. So the microbiome. Okay, hypothetically. So what we can say from studies, when you have changes in the nervous system, the microbiome, without any food input, this was done in animal models. Within 3 hours of a shift in the hypothalamus, they saw that the gut microbiome had completely altered, completely retiled. Um, so that suggests that there is some signaling going on between the host and the microbes. We already know that there's this tight symbiosis between the microbiome and the host. It kind of suggests that there is, ways that there is, that these communicate that we haven't really understood at this point.
Right.
It could be metabolized. There could be some kind of bioelectrical thing. I've seen people suggesting light as a communication method. I don't know. Like ultimately, that's something that studies will continue to to show how that works. But what we can say is that if the nervous system is shifting into sympathetic, we can, or other things that we can see a shift in the microbiome. Now, hypothetically, one of the things that I've noticed, and one of the things that this model focuses on, is this fermentation syndrome. So the elevation of like your strep, your staph, your E. coli, your Klebsiella, Candida, Aspergillus, proteobacteria. There's a range of different things that are able to produce alcohol and or acetaldehyde. And the net effect of that is that when we look at, this is the opioid cascade. So when we have, and this is essentially using the dopamine metabolism alterations to it, when we have either oxidative stress, when we have acetaldehyde, it ends up inhibiting the ALDH, the aldehyde dehydrogenase enzyme activity. And what that does is it allows one of the dopamine metabolites, the next one, which is dopal, to build up. And then dopamine and dopal react directly to create salsolinol, or THP. And that is the top of the pathway towards codeine and morphine. The body actually produces morphine
Yeah.
endogenously. So
Oh,
if somebody's got metabolic dysfunction, if they've got these problems with glycogen storage, then that means that their parasympathetic signaling nervous system is basically unavailable. It's not working. So
right.
parasympathetic signaling requires localized energy storage. It requires glycogen. In the absence of that, all you're left with is sympathetic signaling. And that's like your lipolysis, beta oxidation, and everything else. So in that state, if that becomes too far out of homeostasis, if there's too much sympathetic signaling in metabolism and not enough effectiveness of lipolysis and fatty acid oxidation and things, it's possible that that signaling becomes excessive, and the microbiome may step in and try to correct that. And it might do that by fermenting the carbohydrates, and sometimes proteolysis, to produce alcohol and then very quickly acetaldehyde. And then that acetaldehyde ends up triggering the morphine synthesis inside of our cells, to then end up regulating it. So that's CAMP-PK8. There's more info on that if we look at figure 18 is probably the nice one to look at for
All
this.
deriving from the nervous system.
Yeah, yeah. But the nervous system, it becomes circles and cycles and loops. So basically, you could have the metals and the minerals creating the problems with the glycogen storage, which then can create the sympathetic overdrive, which then, spirals and spirals and spirals. There's actually I'll just jump out of that and I'll show you. There's in the, I think it is here in the introduction, a couple of nice little, just simple kind of diagrams. Like
Yeah.
this whole thing basically becomes a spiral. And you've got to include trauma, you've got to include quite a number of things, but it becomes a progressive disease, progressive dysfunction.
Right.
And so bit by bit by bit, we end up with less and less functionality. So more dysregulated metabolism, less capabilities, more constraints. And then the pathway back out, I've labeled this one as MECFS because, that's the labeled disease, if you like, that I was originally studying. Long COVID, Lyme, fibromyalgia, everything else basically has this same cascade, at least according to the data and the modeling. So it's just a progression, different variables associated with the
Well,
different feature presentations.
do you think do you think by and large a lot of people are not getting enough B1 from their diet?
I
Like,
mean,
do you see it useful as a supplement just because they're not getting a lot of it, or do you think it's more downstream of these other
I think it's
issues?
probably more downstream of the other issues.
Okay.
Our diets are problematic. I mean, there are all sorts of things. We could have a conversation and just focus entirely on the diet and what
Yeah.
happens with the food systems.
Right.
One of the things that I get frustrated with is the what happens with the soil.
Yeah.
So there were studies basically showing that the level of the minerals in the soil from 1950 through to, I think in that study was like 2008, it dropped more than 50%.
Yeah.
So what that means is at the same time, we've started using large amounts of nitrogen and fertilizers. So we get these big plump vegetables and things, but they're actually quite devoid of
And
the
yeah.
minerals.
Yeah.
So you can eat, it's like, oh, it's great. I'm eating, all this big pumpkin and potato and things like that. But, for 100 grams of the same thing, you're getting 50% less mineral content.
Yeah.
So
See.
that's one of the challenges. And then, at least here in Australia and other places, some bright people had the idea that we should take the minerals that are coming out of our body, like from the food and from the everything else, and we should pump them into the sea.
Yeah.
So the minerals, instead of going back into the soil and allowing us to continue this cycle, is actually growing, plants and aquatic ecosystems. So I
Yeah.
think there needs to be conversation around how we deal, with some of that. So yeah,
Yeah. Okay. All right. I got a couple other questions for you. Let's wrap this up a little bit. Overall, these are just going to be rapid fire. Do you think liver flushing is useful?
can be. Yeah,
Andy?
can be. So when there's buildup of biofilm and various other things in the bile ducts, I think the old Holder Clark recipe was the one that everyone knew, and I think who was the one that came after that? Moritz or something modified that
Yeah. Andrea
recipe ever so
Moritz.
slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the short answer is yes. I've done that one myself, and I definitely have noticed functionally some improvements. I haven't gone to the lengths of actually then looking at what came out and was that a cholesterol stone? Was that
Yeah.
what was it?
Right.
Um, but I think if nothing else, doing that sort of process is useful for perhaps flushing biofilms out of some of these like bile ducts in the upper GI and things like that. I think there is a good benefit to it.
And a lot of that comes, well, a lot of part of the protocol is the malic acid. Are you a fan of malic acid?
Yes and no. In not as a daily thing.
Yeah.
I think the one of the problems is if you were to take malic acid a lot regularly, it'll actually dysregulate the mitochondrial function. So having high levels of malic acid will ultimately end up potentially tipping you into creating lactic acid more readily. So it
Interesting.
basically shifts the metabolism towards anaerobic glycolysis.
And the pro would be it can help chelate metals.
Yeah, that kind of thing. So used
Softens
for the
them.
right context and
Right.
not as a daily thing. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Um, Thoughts on parasites?
Yeah. I mean, we accumulate those much like every other pathogen.
Yeah.
They're all their own separate challenges. I mean, the body, when it's working, does a pretty good job of clearing a lot of these things a lot of the time. That said, I think, with pets and livestock and things like that, we get into a routine of actually deworming and whatever, the animals, and yet we seem to forget that that's important for us as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, there are a number of different ways, but different parasites, different tools.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on L-reuteri as a
great.
introducing it as a good?
Yeah, that's a really useful. I mean, it's got antimicrobial functions. It's one of the temple guards and janitors. It's really nice for making sourdough bread. It can produce
Yeah.
BH4.
Yeah.
Does a whole range of things. It's a good species to have on board.
Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah, we've covered a lot of stuff, Joshua. Anything else that I guess how can people they can obviously go to your website. They can are you offering any kind of like practitioner guidance in the future?
Well, I do a lot of one-on-one and one-on group training now with clinicians. Reach out. There's no cost around any of that. It's basically just an outreach program. We're trying to get more and more clinicians available for helping people. The challenge is basically just getting over the knowledge hump because there's a lot to pick up. It's a process that is ongoing for a number of months. The new tools are making it a whole lot easier to communicate and translate, so that's going well. Moving forward, we're actually setting up a new institute, and people can register for that. The website is collabsci.org, so Collaborative Sciences Institute. There'll be chapters in Europe, US, and Australia initially, and we'll see how that expands from there. But usual story, we just got to set up the accreditation. You'll get your continuing education points and everything else.
Yeah.
So.
Okay,
mm,
cool. Yeah, I think this is a good place to stop. We covered a lot. I really think people are going to find this valuable. Um, I guess the last question I have is have you learned anything over the past couple weeks or months that was like an aha moment for you or that you found really fascinating?
Yeah. Look, the one thing that I have really had the big aha moment. I mean, apart from the metal detox intervention being so amazingly
Yeah.
productive, autism spectrum disorder. And I've posted a little bit about this on Twitter, but you can see this in the modeling. Figure 14 and figure 18 basically describe it. But we have this common metabolic dysfunction that you see the elevated glutamate across ADHD, autism spectrum, PTSD, quite a number of other things, ME/CFS, long COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So the mechanism in the modeling basically describes how that problem with the glutathione metabolism leads to the elevated glutamate inside the cell. And then we have this, one feature across all the spectrum of all these different disorders is that we see this dysregulated stress response. So instead of just adrenaline giving us some energy and, maybe helping us get out of a sticky situation, it actually creates this glutamate fry, this excitotoxicity issue, and then basically ramps up our perception, our perceived threat assessment and things like that. It becomes highly dysregulated and drives us into quite unpleasant states. So the metabolism that I'm describing, the zinc deficiency, various other dietary deficiencies, that's a big piece. But the metals, it really is the metal accumulation which appears to be driving the autism spectrum, ADHD, everything else. There are extra steps. It's like ripples in the cascade, loops,
Right.
whatever. But ultimately, what I've seen anecdotally, and I'm looking forward to getting this into a clinical trial setting, is that if you can rapidly remove the aluminum and some of the other metals, you can transform the metabolism. You can get rid of this glutamate dysregulation, this dysregulated stress response, the hypoxaluria, all of the problems with visual and auditory overstimulation, everything else which you see in all of these disorders.
Yeah. It's the metals.
So we're kind of at that point where I think medicine could and should have been many decades ago in actually being able to help people no longer have these, you know, dysfunctions and dysregulation.
Because of the toxicity.
Hmm.
One other question I just thought of that I wanna ask you. Vitamin D,
Hmm.
do you think that the metals are impacting the D to a big extent?
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at the vitamin D metabolism, like 1 alpha hydroxylase and some of the other things, that pathway is highly dependent on NAD-P redox and NAD. So ultimately, you'll see bottlenecks in different forms of vitamin D. So you might end up with like low, look, depending on where they're at in the whole overall progress, but you might have low calcitrol versus the calciferol, for example.
Yeah.
It just depends on where that bottleneck is. But the 1 alpha hydroxylase inhibition is a big piece. So you end up with low active form of vitamin D.
Yeah.
So that then feeds back into the inflammatory cascade and hepcidin and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, absolutely.
Are you a fan of taking synthetic supplement D vitamin D?
It's in the protocol. I do see some benefit to it, but ultimately you want to fix that NAD and NADP redox.
Yeah.
So that's the constraint.
Yeah. Joshua, this has been great. Dude, you are a wealth of knowledge, man. Thank you for all your work. It's truly amazing, and I hope this podcast episode helps a lot of people. And I'm sure that a lot of people are gonna be going to your site and experiment with these.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me. It's been really quite a lot of fun and good questions.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend.